the organisers of this day, which I think has been a sort of intellectual feast of theory right into practice, into the sharp end of practice, with Johann's presentation at the end. Now, of course, this is a point where, as I said, you can ask questions, but I thought there's a point I would like just to start with for discussion. I'm actually going to direct it first to Charles for reasons which I hope will become obvious, which is that there's a very long tradition in architecture of appropriating ideas from other disciplines. I mean, we think back to Vitruvius, which I'm sure Brian Hatton could recite in the original Latin, that famous passage of all the things architects need to know. And I wonder if there isn't something particular about the way architecture acts as a discipline that makes it uniquely well suited to being able to pick up all the various threads which somehow fall into the category of emergent technologies. And of course, you as someone with experience in at least two disciplines may well have a view on that, which is why I directed towards you first.
Sure. Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think it's that, mother of the arts kind of issue. The architecture has the ability to kind of synthesize all of those things. I mean, not necessarily in one person, but in one kind of, I suppose, project team, right through from the kind of original vision, maybe the tools that inform that original vision, and the techniques that are used to design it, the techniques that are used to analyze it, the techniques that are used to fabricate it, right through to completion.
Right.
I mean, I think in a way it's just always been the case, the architecture. But I mean, I personally subscribe to zeitgeist theory, so I'm consciously aware as a designer to try and make contemporaneous objects. So I almost feel like an obligation to kind of assimilate that technology.
Sure. Could I ask anyone who's got a question either to catch my eye or even do that old-fashioned thing of sticking your arm in the air? But perhaps, George, would you like to comment on this? You've obviously worked with architects, but you also come from a different disciplinary background.
Well, I mean, I agree with what Charles says. I think it's almost our normal reaction at the human level. It is a kind of discipline which, in many ways, does have to bring in all the others. I mean, at different levels, in different depths. But I mean, going back to some of historical things, I mean, don't forget that when you look at architects of 200, 300, 400 years ago, I mean, we didn't have mechanical engineers, structural engineers, architects. I mean, the architect was everything, even the builder. Yeah. So I think the division, if anything, is an artificial one which happened later. I'm very glad that, in fact, we are at a time when these things will come back, these things are going to come back again.
Right. Question from the audience. Yes, sir.
A few comments.
Yeah.
Thanks. A few comments, and perhaps it'd be interesting to hear people's sort of random thoughts about them. But first is obviously that evolution, natural evolution, does have its flaws, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And that the designer perhaps has the luxury of being able to design with purpose, but also to be able to do some Lamarckian type evolution, and also cross-fertilization between species, which wouldn't normally occur in nature. Which so it brings back into play the role of the designer, perhaps even more, and also in the design of the original seed, if you like, or the seeds that then. That's my. Shall I just
do you want
go
to
through
respond to that?
Yes, I think it'd be better if you don't mind if we just take one point at a time.
Okay,
So,
thanks.
may I just ask before are you a designer or a biologist or both?
I'm both. I've just done a master's on the role of biomimetics in environmentally responsive architecture.
Right.
And I should come to this before finishing it.
Okay.
Can I start?
Yes, Mike.
I think with genetic algorithms, although we can go back to 1952, is it? John Holland, are still in some ways very, very preliminary. So if we look at kind of recent debates in evolutionary biology, typically Hawking School kind of debate, the number of models within evolution generally is quite high, two major groups, but within that several different kinds of positions. Genetic algorithms are kind of 1950s biology, although they're contemporary computation. So there, you know, for example, we're trying to look at speciation in the population. It's just at the beginnings of bringing in more subtle evolutionary concepts into GAs. So I think your point is interesting, but I think quite soon you will see kind of wider spread of different kinds of ways of working with populations, with species, with competing species. One illuminates another, which is, you know, like humans do and animals do. We're not yet able to mathematically model the intense competitions in an environment, which is one of the only one, but it is a mechanism of evolution.
Shall we, George, would you like to?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the purpose of evolution in a biological context is survival. Now, what is the translation of survival in an architectural context? This is where the designer has got a role. He's got to design in his mind what that means. Because if you're using a genetic algorithm, you're using the mechanism of biology perhaps, but not the same goal as biology. And so you have to reinterpret. And Achim has said it very clearly. If you look at all the parameters that you can play, hybridization, cross-fertilization, whatever, but then your fitness for purpose thing, which is really the most stringent one, which is really the one which dictates whether you are going to survive or not, that's your decision. So no matter how many buttons you can push or whatever not, how far you're going to rate that particular bit is pretty crucial. And I think this is still going to come from here, I hope.
Michael would like to make a comment.
Just a very short one. I think there's always a great tendency to place approaches or notions against one another. I think the hallmark, at least for me, in a kind of particular way of working with both approaches, is really synergy. Now, as I said earlier on, I have no qualms putting design-related, maybe spatial or other kinds of requirements into that process that eventually brings a result. No? So I wonder whether it's necessarily so good to operate on a dichotomous mode, or rather just simply to say these are different strands of feeding a project and that's okay.
I think that's the way to go. Yeah, they're just tools. They're all tools.
Could I come back to you for your next comment? Because I know that Brian Hatton would like to come in here as well.
Well,
Brian, would you mind using the microphone?
Sorry. Well, concerning survival and evolution, it seems, I may be wrong, but it seems to me that the only example that I saw this afternoon of that is not to do with, was not at the base level of the designer making a strategic decision about the design of the building, but about the engineering in the selection of the final components. And I was particularly thinking of where you were selecting the final joints out of a whole range of them at the British Museum. Where there you have a range of choices, and then finally you said it came down to which one looked best. And that seemed to be the only point at which then something like survival of the fittest actually occurred, except that the criterion of fitness there is irrational. It's to do with human desire. And this brings us back to a point at which why we desire something, and I can't see how you can escape then humanity's need to represent. And it seems to me that one of the problems with all naturalistic analogies is that it tends to sort of overlook the fact that architecture is a symbolic system of representations. It's not a natural system.
Perhaps, Achim, you could comment about this, because I think you made quite clearly that there are strategic decisions you make about the parameters and about the generation of form and structure and shape in this sort of strategy.
I think there's actually quite a difference between having different options, like in your case, so you have different various options and you choose one, or you actually have an evolutionary process that by actually the rules that you use to run the process has an inbuilt evaluation process. That doesn't mean that you can't intervene with it, but I think these are two essentially different ways of working. And I think they can sometimes overlap, because within the evolutionary process you can also treat the outcome of, for example, a generation as not as a fitness ranked population, but as a couple of choices. I think that's what I try to make very clear, that you have possibilities to intervene with other ways of actually analyzing in the evolutionary process than the ones that you actually set in the beginning. So you can almost, the evolutionary process has the possibility to evolve, so to say. And also your assessment criteria can change along the way. So I think the last thing that I would say is that it should, I think you miss the greatest opportunity if you imagine evolutionary processes as something that you somehow have run in the machine. You wake up in the morning and you choose the one that is the nicest. Because I think then you miss really the possibilities that come with that. And I think the main possibility is that it introduces really a completely different set of minds of approaching, for example, the issue of choice. Because all of a sudden you realize that you're concerned, for example, with open-ended search, so there's not an optimal goal. So that is a completely different way of choosing, for example. I would assume that you're not looking for the best, but you're just looking for one that is actually the next step of another step to come, and things like that. So I think that's the interesting aspect of dealing with that, probably. Not so much looking at it as possible solutions for a problem, which I think would not be more choice-based, but really for unfolding possibilities that were not possible to see beforehand.
Charles, you want to say?
Yeah, I also think connected with that, there's an important issue of aesthetics. Yeah, which is, I picked something up from a question Michael asked of Fry Otto when he was lecturing here about when they discovered, these soap film shapes and so forth. What was it like, the minute they discovered that? And, finding these beautiful forms. And I remember his comment saying, well, we didn't actually see beauty, that it took a while before we realized what we were onto. And I think there's an important point there when you actually, because we're also encountering a lot of new forms in architecture, and that I think you have to revisit your whole way of aesthetically relating to something, because basically when something's new, it's unfamiliar, you don't have any real reference point, and it's not easily categorized, and you can't place it. I mean, I think a lot of the shapes we see now they're within a kind of existing formal language of product design, automobile styling, so they can be reasonably easily processed within kind of existing reference points. But occasionally you come up against something that's, from an engineering standpoint is exactly right, but it's incredibly ugly, And I think you also have to remove your aesthetic prejudice from that, because, it's something new, and actually something ugly could be incredibly good. It could be a huge leap forward.
We are also still, when we talk about aesthetics, I think still very much caught within 19th century or concepts which evolved in the 19th century, and they were evolved particularly by people like Goethe and people who knew Goethe, followed Goethe, and to deal with new sorts of technological experience and social experience which were happening then, and perhaps have not really caught up with the technological possibilities yet. I know that Mike wants to say something.
Yeah,
about
I
this.
just, I don't know quite how far to do this, but I would challenge two of your statements. The first and the biggest one, that architecture is a symbolic language. Did you say it was symbolic?
I think it's a symbolic system.
Symbolic system. We wouldn't say that what we do necessarily excludes that. On the other hand, I think it's difficult to sustain your argument to say what architecture is. I think it's constantly changed throughout history what it is, what it does. And along the same lines as Charles, I believe we're not separate from the rest of humanity. We have the same kind of ideas in the air, same kind of ambitions. Aesthetics evolve at a cultural level and an individual one. And I think those things are, historically, you can separate periods where they're wildly different. So, we don't see that we're not certain whether what we're doing is beautiful or ugly. On one project we did together, we simultaneously all found it both. Those things are under revision culturally. I feel we're part of that. So.
Who'd like to ask a question? Then I come back to you.
Well, my question was I need to start with a kind of observation, and it's really that I'm quite persuaded to some extent by this kind of proposal of a new kind of paradigm that you're adopting, and it was quite often during the presentation set in opposition to the modernist paradigm in terms of its mechanism, and that was kind of having the machine metaphor rather than this evolutionary one. But I also feel with modernism, when I think about that, I also think about how intimately concerned it was with the human, the bodily and haptic experience of architecture, even though it was in a very kind of instrumental fashion, and also in social processes. And I feel we've heard a lot today about the kind of the form-finding element of design and the engineering and the construction, but not a great deal about what the social implications or the implications of experience might be, apart from Michael started to hint at those kind of processes. And I'm particularly asking this question because I wouldn't like to see this kind of new paradigm be merely about novel forms and merely about, kind of providing blobby shells for shopping malls. I'm sure it could do more than that. So I'd just like to hear what your responses are to that.
Michael should be able to expand on the hints he made in his talk.
Yeah, first and foremost, I would like to say that I would never go as far as claiming a new paradigm, because that has somehow become the new paradigm, to claim a new paradigm. I would be somehow more humble, and I would say it's probably more an expansion of the available tool set. And I very much agree with you that we need to incorporate all sorts of observations and concerns. Funnily enough, some of them can also be discussed on a formal basis because it comes to the question of representation in a very odd, unfamiliar shape. Obviously, it hasn't come yet to represent something, and so when you deal, for instance, with institutional buildings, it's quite interesting to see what the repercussions might be, or what the repercussions of an unfamiliar space that is not necessarily programmed, but that provides a differentiated environment, what kind of appropriation that might yield. So I don't think that we're unaware of that. We're tackling one level of complexity. I think we're trying to attach the conversation or the debate to those other points, and in that sense, I think, just to return to the initial point, it's more an expansion of the toolset rather than a paradigm claim.
Do you wanted to ask another question? Then I'll come to you. That's okay.
Kind of related, really. I think that, I mean, for me, one of the most interesting emergent properties from observation of nature, if you like, especially at the larger scales of observation, beyond sort of organ and cell and organism, is when you look at dynamic systems like an ecosystem, you get a lot of you get models for sustainability, and I think that Joachim was talking about the kinds of tools that we can begin to apply to the evolutionary process to sort of respond to that. And perhaps slightly tongue-in-cheek, I was wondering about the post-agricultural project. I mean, it seems to be almost a sort of evolutionary convergence on or towards something like a rainforest where you've got this multiple canopy system. And I'm wondering whether if you began to, as you incorporate some of the other fitness criteria, like toxicity, embodied energy, those kind of environmental criteria in particular, whether in fact you wouldn't end up with a rainforest. So slightly
Would it be a rainforest?
I think, as I said, it's an open-ended search, so it's quite hard to say what's going to end up with. But I think that what is interesting, I think that is somehow underlying the way you ask the question, is that it's actually an open model that can be continuously fed with information. So you start off with actually really just the structural requirements, then I actually fed in the requirements for a certain climatic conditions and light conditions. There were actually some concerns about other ecological things. There were actually quite a lot of concerns about smell issues, because that's at the end of the day also quite important if you deal with some of our hybridization of agriculture with other activities. But it was really not an aim to come up with some kind of solution to the problem that actually exists in the Netherlands. It was rather to build up that open model that can be continuously fed. And I think at the end of the day, that's going to build up a complexity that has is really like an ecology. That's also why I think that's why I call it morphoecology, because it's it becomes such an intense relation between actually morphology and the way the habitat, or that habitat actually provides for the inhabitants, that if that is your model or understanding for rainforest, then it's sort of tending towards that.
It seems like an incredibly exciting kind of promise for that whole area you're looking at. It's mind-blowing, the potentials, I think.
Also, actually, I'd just like to ask Johan how you would feel about building a structure for a rainforest, whether it would be possible. Keep it brief, but would you like to?
I'm not as familiar as the rest of the team here with these theories, and we're coming from the other end, really. We are confronted with ideas, and we can contribute in order to how to realize them. What I found out, and maybe that's 2 steps down, that to understand the needs and the behavior of a structure helps also to find the best solution architecturally sometimes. And when you look at big structures and when you see how the forces flow, I think this creates part of the architecture sometimes. And if the architect, and if the architect drifts away too much from it and if he ignores it, I personally believe, but it's subjective, it doesn't look nice anymore. So we are not there at the beginning of the job. Sometimes we are called in quite early if it's a complex structure, just to comment on whether it can be realized. The economic aspects come into it, but the theoretical basis is something I'm not as familiar with. My focus always is, can I do it, how can I do it, what are the costs, which is not really the main part of this discussion, to be honest, but, but I think it's important at the end of the day, if we want to realize something, it's important as well.
Exactly. I know that Mike, and then Mike would like to say something on this.
Just a small point in that, which is to do with the nature of cities, and I think sustainability suffered initially, at least in this country, by not having, in my view, kind of sound scientific basis. Part of what we think these kind of explorations reveal is that when Michael and I started our research 6 years ago, we did find that biologists, or mathematical biologists, did actually have very good models of things like rainforests, and they were trying to do these things, and we thought, why can't we use a similar mathematical process to model what happens in a building, or particularly in relation to buildings in the city. So I would hope that the kind of ecological drive that we're interested in would result in new intelligent cities that are responsive, that would be mathematically related to a rainforest, but wouldn't look like it or behave. But the maths would be the same.
Diversity and interconnection.
Okay, George and then Mike.
I mean, on the same point, I think it's very important to understand also in an ecological context that if you look at the situation where the normally quoted figure for sort of heat losses in buildings or energy losses in buildings is running at 30%, 40% or something like that. Okay, I mean, if biology was running on the same principles, I mean, we wouldn't be here, I can assure you. So what I'm saying is that energy management, I mean, at the end of the day, that is at the root or at the start of everything. Energy management is a very important thing, ecologically as well. And now you can benefit not because you have implemented some kind of clever scheme for recycling, but simply by having less to recycle in the first place. I think one has got to be very, very careful to identify what is really the best strategy for an ecosystem. Is it not to produce the pollutants in the first place, or is it to find a clever way of getting rid of the pollutants? I think this is a very important point that unfortunately often is mixed, but people get a little bit sort of obsessed by one particular aspect of it. I think it's very, very important to make sure, and the biological paradigms also, I think, need to be interpreted correctly. Okay, are these things producing pollutants, or are they minimizing the manufacturing of pollutants? Don't forget that some of the best poisons on Earth are all coming from plants. Okay, so it's not that toxicity is an unknown feature. It's your question of control or disposal, and control very often is a better strategy than complicated disposal. Yeah, that's it.
I found the sequence of the last two questions quite interesting. One that relates the concern of the designer towards the human factor in the design, may that be a social or experiential factor. And on the other hand, the question to the designer, what will it be? That's an interesting sequence of questions, because what it reveals is that there's a human factor on both sides. I think we're kind of fascinated in training ourselves to get a certain sensibility for working with that stuff, in order then to be able to incorporate more and deal with it better. So I think this is not a self-consumed moment, but one has to gain a certain sensibility in order to be able to say more. And I recall many moments also in Johann's presentation, even though you're saying you're coming from the other side, but where you just said this was more interesting for us. And I think that's important to realize that there is a recognition of a certain interesting possibility which probably cannot be quite pictured yet, because enough work has to be done in that realm, and then through that work also the incorporation of these effects or these concerns will be possible. I just want to say there's also a need for us to train ourselves in order to be able to answer these kind of questions.
You had a question.
I've got a thought that troubled me even before coming to the workshop today. And I'd like to phrase it as a two-part question, probably to the speakers of the morning part. I guess that will be addressed to you. What is your view as to what we've seen today, whether it is genetic or generative?
Yeah, well,
Do you want to start? Yes, and then George, perhaps.
As designers, we find these processes interesting because they do generate a lot of things, and so we're quite happy on a kind of creative level to make use of things in a generative manner. In a wider sense, if I followed correctly your question, I'm not sure I do, but in a wider sense, you can say that all cultural production in one way is genetic. The things survive and get passed on, and they constantly mutate. In an architectural sense, I think if I can take the idea about the paradigm shift that people have been talking about, we're not claiming that we're doing it. Our view is that paradigm shifts are actually sometimes 100 years or more long. And we think we're sort of half of the way into a big shift. It's not that we've invented any of this. And most genetic systems have been in use in product design, I think, 15 years. Ordinary things like the optimization of the two metals in a flywheel on a car. I know the first GA was written for that more than 20 years ago. The architecture is normally the kind of last part where technology reaches. If you look at the economics of industry around the world, architecture is actually really, really tiny. We don't invent steel processes. Most of those things are done for much bigger industries. And if we're clever, we're just kind of taking part in it. Did I understand your...
I'm trying to sort of think through this problem that was raised earlier about the potential of this whole process and how the designer can employ it. And I think I'm partly frustrated that the whole genetic process stops at drawing board.
Well, we don't actually have drawing boards, but I know what you mean.
The virtual drawing.
Yes.
And then architecture is freezing, and then it passes on to construction as a fixed artifact. Of course, it's going to be some time until we've got the capability to animate things like nature does.
Just to go on with that, we had brief conversations just before. Despite our ambitions of what architects would have of working with people and manufacturers and engineers, we all want to work together right at the beginning, at the concept stage. What we're fighting against is a legislative framework of how architecture is produced, which tends to follow the kind of 19th century idea of the professions and separating things. So it's quite difficult when, you know, if I commission you to do a builder and say, do a building for me, and I want you to come with a team of, you know, all the people, you know, but the way I have to get my money from the bank and do insurances and so forth means that I divide that up into a whole series of steps, and those are identified with different professions. So although I think that's the biggest hurdle that prevents, you know, the more rapid acceleration of this is a legislative framework.
Michael, would I make a quick point then? I'm sure George will have something to say about that.
I would say your frustration can only come up if you look at the relation between form generation, form finding, and form adaptation in one particular way. But if you see this as incorporative processes, they may actually span from the design phase all the way to what the building does on site. I mean, the thing is, even the two traditional tasks of form finding go all the way from the design phase to constructing in that particular, within that particular logic. But once the kind of structure is on site, it will still do all sorts of things. So one can probably extend these kind of notions, and one can find within that shorter moments of where you generate form, or where you adapt form, or where you put something new into place. The only thing I want to say here is that the operational terms need to be sorted out before frustration can come up.
I think it is the case in at least several cases of microarchitecture that I'm aware of, that there is a design process that is happening, and when I say it freezes, when it becomes a building, of course the building changes after that, but it has nothing to do with the original design process that was happening.
Yeah, but the design process, the form generation, does not equal necessarily form finding. Now, it would be strange to say that what is happening in the form generation process should equal what is happening in the form adaptation condition. You know, it's an operational term, not necessarily the same thing. But
could you think of instead employing your agents virtually in the design process, build your agents and release them out and let them define the architecture?
You could, but that you're just trying to come to an alternative definition of these terms that I'm putting forward. That's what we need to do in order to have this conversation. You know?
Yeah, that's why I'm asking from the question: is it genetic or is it generative?
Perhaps George could say something about that.
Well, I don't know is the answer, but if I got it right from what and the answers, if you're looking at something which is perpetually evolving as a design, I can see the frustration. As you say, at some point someone's got to freeze the design because someone has got to start sort of adding up and ordering materials and check
These basic things.
these basic little things at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But when you're looking at it in your own time frame,
Yeah.
okay, you've got to look at it at a much bigger time frame, because if you take now a bird flying out there, it is a frozen design, but it has still got a dynamic component, because even that being, not as an individual, but as a concept, is moving in an evolutionary scale. So I think you've got to make a distinction between the individual, which sooner or later has got to be frozen, otherwise it's not going to become a reality. But then the species, if you like, the concept, the conceptual approach, that can evolve over whatever time scale you want.
Let me give you a building example for that, for your question. There are a number of temples in Japan that are rebuilt every 20 years, or some of them in 5 years, depending on the religious event. The form persists for hundreds of years. It's identical geometrically, same amount of material in the same place, every joint the same, but it's constantly, on fixed cycles, rebuilt. So that is the perfect union, or one example I can give you of the union of generative and genetic. But I think also we've only just started to come around to the idea of talking about buildings having a lifespan and architects having to design what the behavior, or think about the behavior of that building during its life. That's really quite recent. I mean, when I was working in offices trying to pay my way through the AA, and more in the office than in the school, you know, you had a design and it was done, and you, if it was 35% cost for heating and ventilation, that was fine, and then it went to the client, and that was the end of the architect's involvement. That was the traditional thing, and then everybody struggled with how to maintain it. And we know wonderful modernist building in North London where they're now having to collect extra money to re-maintain it. So it is a comparatively newish point for architects to start thinking their design doesn't finish on the day they hand it over and they hope they get it paid, but they're designing something that has a life for a certain span.
I think it's also, sorry, I think it's also very important to actually make a bit of difference between, if you say it doesn't actually remain to be on the drawing board, what I can understand is that you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I read in between the lines of your question is that you somehow don't make it very clear whether you talk about a dynamic adaptation of that structure that is yet to come, no? In terms of really a sort of kinetic aspect of the structure then adapts to certain forces. Because I think what I tried to make very clear in my second talk is that I think what is the great thing about these morphogenetic processes is that they derive differentiation, and that is obviously a process that is somehow geometry changing while it's generating geometry, but what I'm personally much more interested in is actually the integral aspect of the performance. Mm-hmm. And you have to imagine that these differentiated morphologies are actually exposed to quite a highly dynamic environment. So I think once you actually realize that there is somehow the dynamic effects, performative effects of a differentiated structure that is actually the result of a generative or evolutionary process, then I think are highly responsive. And I think there are quite the differences between responsive, dynamic, adaptable, and differentiated. But I think if you really then want to have somehow a morphology that evolves, you could also imagine that this is more the performative aspects of that morphology rather than the actual shape changing. No? And I think that's one of the goals to embed, that through the differentiation of the performative aspects, you actually allow that further evolution. Through, for example, the mutation and migration of certain activities within constantly changing conditions, rather than a constantly changing shape.
Okay, Michael wants to make a very short comment on this before we go to your question.
I think it's interesting to bring up the notion of when do you freeze a design, because one would actually have to identify what do you mean by that. Once a physical structure has arrived at a stable configuration, what about dynamic stability, etc.? You know, I mean, you're a little bit imprecise by defining what exactly you mean by frozen, because there's so many dynamic conditions that continue always across a point in time that you wish to identify as the final state. Now the design has finished, now the structure is inside. This is not so easy to somehow pinpoint a simple moment in time, even if you think how something needs to be constructed in one shape in order then to be released into another, and what happens from there. Very hard to say when is this moment where something is being frozen.
Yeah, I look at it, I won't go on that, but I just look at it at the rate of change allowed to define, you know, to distinguish between stages where this is actually happening and this is practically not happening. And I do resonate with all the comments about, you know, what is the time scale you're looking at it on, and you know, how do you really frame the problem. So I do understand what.
Okay, I think we really must move on. While the microphone is being taken over to the gentleman there who's been waiting very patiently, anyone else has a question, please put your hand up.
Thank you. I have to say, I'm actually not particularly interested in design anymore. That's from working with some large projects. Because everything gets dumbed down very quickly. And it's really not in design and coming up with, you know, brilliant solutions in engineering and so on. It's really money and politics. So I would really like to see these methods be extended into economical and political sciences.
Mike, what's the prospect of that? I think you're the best person to...
Some of the mathematics that we use come from Brownian analysis of the US stock market. again, people who were interested in money were a lot quicker into this stuff than architects and engineers by about 50 years. There are, I don't know if you follow the market, but there are kind of two modes of analysis. One is called a fundamentalist, who knows everything about a company and all the people that work there and what they make, and you know, and they approach it that way. There are the what market people call chartists and what we would call the nerds, I guess, or something like that, who only look at fluctuations, who find mathematical relations in oscillations. When you look at the graphics for that, it looks identical if you map thermodynamics of a system in equilibrium, and then when it gets far from equilibrium starts to collapse. You can overlay the diagrams and you can't tell the difference. So I think, I mean, I agree with you, majority of building is an economic act. And you could look at cities as a kind of repository of what falls out of economic activity, and there are urban theorists who do that. And they use more or less the same techniques that we're putting, or trying to put to use for designing material structures, for understanding them as energy systems. So I think, I don't know, I think the money side has actually preceded us by about 50 years with these sciences. I do know one day trader who has what he calls an intelligent system. So one of the first people to invest in AI as a serious kind of, no architectural office has an AI system yet, but many market traders who work from their living room do. And that's extraordinary.
People who theorised how hedge funds should work win the Nobel Prize for Economics one year. And then the following year there was a large crash in the market that caused hedge funds to need massive bailouts, which presumably doesn't happen, George, perhaps quite so often when these techniques are used to model scientific as opposed to social scientific.
No, it's true. I mean, it's a different kind of approach you have to use, because it's really, as Mike says, you're really now in a statistical world, because you've got to rely on large numbers and individuals with their own random behavior, little sort of envelope of random behavior may change from point to point, from time to time. So politics, social sciences, economics, certainly a part of the thing. My question, which I think is prompted by what you said, is, does something which looks nice or it's appreciated at a social level, economic level, has to be necessarily associated with being more expensive? The challenge to me is just that. The challenge is not necessarily to go the route, as you say. Very often it's true that it is the lowest common denominator which wins. But my point is, does it have to be the lowest common denominator? I remember years ago when I had my colleague in the construction management talking about building material, building process, and whatever not. And you know, economics of building maintenance. And you make things out of wood, and people will try to use the lowest possible grade wood they can lay their hands on. Then someone paints it over, and then someone has got to spend time to strip it off and paint it again, whatever not. He says, if you do the calculation over sort of, even without being over-optimistic, 25, 30 years life of your house, you might as well have built it out of titanium. In the first place, it would be cheaper. It would be cheaper after 30 years if you built it out of titanium. The difference is, again, time scales again. You see, if it is the same individual who is investing his time and money in that house, then 30 years is more than acceptable. And say, I'm going to put the money in titanium and forget about maintenance for the last 30 years because I want to go gardening. Okay? But if you've got an item which changes hands, and therefore the ownership of is a shorter telescope period, then the parameters are quite different. And that's where you come down to the lowest common denominator, I think, to some extent.
I think you said something about energy and energy management being something central. I think you can see money as a form of energy.
It is. I agree entirely. You can really do a lot of things by swapping concepts of money with concepts of energy. And this is why the environmental issues, if one does the correct costing, global costing in energy terms, then you should be able to find an equivalent costing or economy in financial terms. there's got to be a reward, financial reward, to being ecologically sound, friendly, whatever not. And I'm sure it's there, except that people can't bring it out yet.
I think we should see if there's any other comment from the members of the audience. If there isn't, I'll ask. Okay.
A quick additional comment that's kind of picking up on what you said you were frustrated with, because in some of my research I kind of hit on that and thought, from the point of view of theorising these ideas of, I'll lump them together, the risk of being picked up on it later on, but of complexity and emergence and evolutionary paradigms, is that, yeah, at some point you do have to choose some iteration and say, well, that's the one that's actually going to be constructed. And then I thought perhaps the way in which you start thinking about that is not to think of form as something which is fixed, is to carry on that thinking and say, well, what does the form do? Now that form also generates, and that to me, kind of answering my question on how I think about it, is that kind of generates physical, experiential responses, unforeseen as well, and social processes, possibly, that are not always predictable, particularly if you step out of the modernist paradigm of just thinking about problem solving and efficiency. It's like you can kind of plop something in there and kind of see what happens.
I think what I'm going to do is ask the panel members, starting with Achim and finishing with Michael, if you have a concluding thought, because I think we should start moving towards a conclusion. Would you like to start, Achim?
Well, I think I leave that to the guests.
Okay, all right, Charles, would you like to?
I need to go this way, do you?
Yes, I do, yes.
Sorry, my imagination was preoccupied with the last comment. I just think, don't want to draw it back there, but I just think all these issues, cost is just it's just another parameter for me. So, but I think what the discussion today surrounds is the idea of a kind of multi-parameter type of optimization of a design exercise, and so maybe sometimes that you have cost problems because the aspirations are just so out of line with the actual resources of the project. But the other layers of optimization can be like services, lighting, structure, and aesthetic parameter. And I think in fact we've always worked this way because it's just that parametric optimization happens in the mind of the designer. Today there's so many more parameters; it's become so much more complex that you need kind of almost like data graphic tools to kind of begin to understand all the complexity of those relationships.
So does it come down to a question of representation and how it's represented?
The design itself?
Well, just your last point.
Yeah.
You're implying that you need new tools of representation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you find is kind of on a project by project basis, often just through serendipity, like the team members come together with the right set of skills to kind of deliver an exceptional result. Probably a few of them handling criteria at different levels.
Right.
And just do the best you can. That's mine.
Helen, you may want to say something about representation.
Well, I was just going to say that emphasise perhaps what Mike and Michael were saying about being at the beginning of something, and when they've just started to put the ideas out there, and when you were talking about whether genetics were generative or part of a bigger process, when we talked about evolutionary techniques earlier, you very much, I think when George and Michael were talking about them, you were talking about perhaps analogies between a much greater system with fewer components and materials becoming more important, and we're a long way from that, but you have to start somewhere.
Right. Johan?
Well, I did say that we are here to realize it, but of course in the discussion I just rethought my statement, and I think we were able to contribute to some solutions in a design process when we were awarded. And coming back to costs and finances, I think we all are here, or we all try to realize what we are developing. Well, I at least can make the statement for myself. I don't want to theoretically develop something which I don't realize, and obviously finances is an important point, because if no investor wants to do it, it won't be built. And I see in building projects is an important step to get further experience and to develop elements further. I got some problems with these parameters, whether it is really possible to determine all parameters, the fitness parameters in the best possible way, and to automatically develop a system which then is the optimal system. What I've learned from my discussions on projects is it's always a compromise. And I'm not only thinking of costs. Cost is a very big restriction, but it's always a compromise. I just was considering discussions we had on the shopping mall. I know the shopping mall shouldn't drive our our development, but realistically they are being built, and finances are there. But if you take a shopping mall, and if you say, how do I develop a roof for a shopping mall? You might look at it from an architectural point of view and say, I want to have a bright shell. Then somebody comes in and says, what do you do with glare? The next one says, look at the comfort level. There are perfect studies, CFD studies, where you can look at the comfort level. What do I take? Do I take the hottest day within 100 years? Do I take a dull day? What is my driving element to really define what I want to have? And I think that's not easy. And finally, the investors come in and say, no daylight should come into the shopping mall because we want to make the shops attractive. The shops should be artificially illuminated, and they should be attracted by the people, not the roof. They come in to lose their money or to spend their money. Sorry. Yeah. So when you look at this complexity, I think it's quite difficult to find the ideal solution, or to nominate one solution as the only one. And I think it really has to do with what are the parameters I'm applying to, what level of importance do I give the various parameters, and coming back to the cost as being one of the dominant one, how do I achieve to make a setup to realize it, which then gives me a lot of information during the construction, which I can use as a next step with the extra experience I have made.
Right, good. George?
Very briefly, I think what Charles has said is very important. The serendipity factor is really crucial in this business. And anything which can help to increase the probability of a serendipity factor really needs to be done. I mean, whether it's discussions, forums, cross-disciplinary activities, whatever not. But it is true that it is one of the most powerful means of adding to that evolutionary process is to get precisely the random events which are at the base of evolution. Okay, it's random things which happen, and then you see what happens. These random events are unlikely to come from just one particular set of thoughts. So that's very important to stimulate that. But again, the other thing that I had in parallel to that is the fact that what kind of architecture perhaps do we need? Perhaps we need different types of architecture for different things, because the things we've been talking about are primarily what I may call prestigious projects. The shopping mall with a nice roof and whatever not. We're not talking about sort of the houses or the row of houses where people are going to have to live.
We might be talking about agricultural sheds.
Well, or agricultural sheds.
And we are going to talk about smart homes next year.
Well, that's right. But I think this is important because, as again, if you look at the prestigious projects, in a sense, they are one-off kind of situations. And in that respect, they are really not very significant in the context of the points which were raised. I mean, the purpose of that thing is to have an impact, not necessarily to have a social function, economic function, or even a practical function. Okay, so in that sense, they have to be taken with a pinch of salt. I think what it would be nice is to translate some of the thoughts which are going into that kind of thing in the more kind of human level, or human scale architecture. That I think is very important.
Good point. Mike?
Two small points.
Yeah.
One really addressing Brian in the way that one of the I came to architecture actually quite late in life, and I worked in dockyards and things like that, and so my understanding of the kind of role of making things was formed before I came to study architecture. And I'd seen, you know, what nowadays I would say are kind of big construction efforts. My understanding then is architecture is a relatively minority activity, sometimes extremely important, but at least in recent years, not really engaged, as George was saying, in a kind of ordinary level of building that, I don't know what the percentages are, but what we all live in, and the stuff where we buy our food, and the kind of ordinary fabric of life. Architecture, after modernism, kind of turned away from that. And when I was a student here, as Brian remembers, those years, they were never part of the kind of architectural, rarely part of the architecture conversation. So we are hoping, I mean, we hope to do smart homes like this, but concentrating on the home next year and so forth. So the other thing, to address your point about the symbolic, I have, and I don't want to sound kind of too wild about this, but in recent years, what's totally fascinated me is the convergence that has happened historically over the last 80 or 90 years between mathematics, the physical sciences of chemistry and physics, and biology. And I find that extremely meaningful. And that the fact that I can find numerical relations between things like galaxies and subatomic particles seems to me extraordinarily meaningful. And in itself, without any effort on my part, symbolic and representation.
Michael.
Yeah, like Mike, I would also like to make 2 points. One is picking up on Charles's comment towards multiparametric optimization. Charles emphasized the multiparametric in that pair of words. I would challenge the word optimization or put the focus there, because one could say, what does optimization mean, and what does it mean, for instance, with respect to what you said, today versus tomorrow versus the day after. So I think what is really interesting is that this conversation allows us to challenge some of our standard notions, such as efficiency, optimization, redundancy, etc. And I don't believe that this is somehow some sort of academic exercise. I think that this has real repercussions. You know, Achim and I were discussing a lot how somehow the competition briefs and the project briefs in Germany have changed over the last couple of years, where quite rarely do you get any kind of description by rooms and square meterage and assignment to certain activities and programs. What you get is what even developers now call performance packages, which allows you to somehow see where might be a lower margin and an upper margin to the extent of which this building has to cater for different things or has to be able to change, etc. So I think this is really the one interesting part that I take away from today, that all these kind of notions would probably, I mean, at least it's an invitation to rethink them and to somehow find a different way of operating on these notions. And the second comment was, I nearly suggested Johann for the Nobel Prize, but unfortunately you decided to acoustically dampen the ramp in the German House of Parliament, because I believe this would have been the only way of getting some good vibrations into this institution.
Well, we wanted to get paid for the work we have done. It was a performance specification, so we were left without no other choice.
Good. Okay, well, I think now we've had a long day. I hope it hasn't been too uncomfortable sitting here. It's been quite warm. We did manage to open some windows, I think. But and I think the more serious point is to say thank you very much to the speakers, but particularly to Michael, Mike, and Achim for making the arrangements for this event and giving everyone, myself included, an opportunity to have an insight into this early stage in the process that could lead to the most fascinating developments in all sorts of areas. So thank you very much. And also remember that the issue of AD will be available from the 25th?
Yeah, 24th.
24th of May.
24th is the official publication
And
date.
you know, I don't know if anyone from the Triangle's here, but Derek may want to order 1 or 2 spare ones, I would have thought, after today. So thank you very much.
Alrighty.
Now it's time for a cup of tea, no?
That's all right. Really terrific job.
Good.
I had like,
Now I can...
well, you know, share my stuff. You're not gonna-